emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 258.JE4606, certificate number 36689. Concordski.
How long has it been since I did a show on the Soviet Union?
Well, they're kind of all about...
Right.
They're kind of all about your Soviet nostalgia.
How about an airplane? How about the last time I did a show on an airplane?
I think it's quite possible the last airplane entry was mine. We don't know what people are...
oh, that's right.
We don't know what order people are listening these to. No, Lost Spitfires of Burma.
Oh, that wasn't that long ago.
No, a mere 18 entries ago.
Well, I mean, I hate to be so on brand, but I did feel like it had been a long time. Perhaps I've never done a show on a Soviet airplane. Is that true? Can you think of one?
Not solely on... I mean, they may have come up.
Yeah.
But you're right. We've done a lot of fighter plane shows, and I don't think any of them were MiGs or similar.
You know, you want to think that what makes it into the omnibus is truly a random selection of topics, right? That don't really express our personal interests or inclinations.
Well, it is from me, but you're a musician. You know to play the hits.
That's right.
Nobody likes to hear somebody at the start of a podcast say, "Good news, we're going to play some of our new facts now."
Well, we joke that that's not true, but I mean, there's a vast majority of your shows that are about Presbyterian nutritionists or Victorian like butterfly collectors, right?
I do like a good Victorian scientist.
Yes.
Victorian amateur scientist. I like a lot of literary shows, although you did the last poetry entry, so
you've been really pandering to the youth too with all of your Teddy Ruxpin shows.
There's nothing the youth like more than Beanie Babies.
Well, what interests me in particular about today's topic, the Concordski, is as you can imagine, it's an airplane. It's about the Cold War, and
it sounds like
it's doomed.
It's not skiing related, which would be your other thing. It has ski at the end, but there are no actual skis to be found in the story.
No, where did that come from? When do you think the first sort of derisive comment made about a Russian thing just appended the ski to the end of it?
Yeah, it's definitely post-Bolshevik. This is not a Tsarist era trope.
Or is that even do we put skis at the end of things that are mocking the Norwegians?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a very specific and limited use Cold War era thing. Because it
kind of comes from...
I don't even know if it's survived into my lifetime. It's really more of a Boris and Natasha era idea of the Iron Curtain, right?
The Ruski.
Yeah, the Ruskies with their Plotskis.
Mm-hmm.
And their, what do they have? Borschtski.
They're Borschtskis. They're intrigue skis. Well, it's called the Concordski. It's an airplane that resembles the Concorde, the first. Rather, I'm sorry. Let me retract that. Not the first. The Concorde being the Western European supersonic passenger jet.
The lone commercially successful supersonic passenger jet in history, right? And it wasn't even that successful.
Well, successful is a relative term. It was not. It was successful only after the governments of the UK and France wrote down the hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds and francs that evaporated during the development of
it's
the
a loss
aircraft.
leader.
Yeah.
A lot of people, they're going to lose money every time you fly on that plane, but think of all the other planes you're going to have to pass to get to the back of the airport. You might just spontaneously impulse buy a Pan Am ticket on the way.
I mean, one of the selling points of supersonic transport was precisely that. Although it was always recognized it was going to cost a lot more. These planes were being designed during an era when fuel was cheap, and so although it was going to cost a lot more to run these aircraft, the amount of time, I mean, you would cut a transatlantic flight in half.
Are there other expenses that get cut by only having to, I guess salaries?
Well, but also you could use a smaller number of planes to make the same number, right. or rather, twice as many trips. So you would only need 5 planes where you would need 10 otherwise to do the same routes.
Half as many meals.
I was
going to say half as much booze, but that's probably not accurate.
Twice as much booze.
Probably.
But booze was cheap then too. But it really, supersonic aircraft seemed like, I mean, unquestionably to sort of central planners and futurists and just the general public in the 1950s, it seemed like advances were being made so quickly in what constituted the leading edge of aircraft technology that it seemed implausible that the end result wasn't going to be sort of universal, faster than sound aircraft, because as soon as it was possible, it seemed like, why would you ever go back?
Yeah, we would not have believed. People then would not have believed if we could go back in time and say the Concorde will be a fairly short-lived, unsuccessful experiment.
And if you can put yourself in the mindset of someone in the 1950s, so much of the prestige of your country and particularly in the Cold War, the prestige of your preferred economic system was kind of tied to your ability to use technology to push the envelope. And if your plane was faster, it by necessity meant that your economic system was better and that your social, the social life of your citizens was better.
That's why the British and French governments were subsidizing this.
And what we don't often remember in the United States is that the Soviet Union, although they did not have the first jet-powered passenger jet, that distinction belongs to the de Havilland Comet, and this is the British de Havilland, not the Canadian de Havilland.
Okay.
But the de Havilland Comet was the first jet airliner, but it was almost immediately grounded because of safety issues. And so for much of the mid-50s, or rather for a few years in the mid-50s, the only operating jet passenger aircraft was a Russian one called the Tupolev 104.
And it was flying commercially. And dependably. And when that era where Khrushchev came over and, toured America and the Russians were yelled in a test kitchen. Yeah,
they were first sort of coming to the West and sort of boisterously parading around. They arrived in Tupolev 104s and the West had no idea this was coming. So they showed up at the beginning of their grand tour in these fully functioning jet powered,
and we'd never seen a passenger jet.
Well, we'd seen the de Havilland, which couldn't cut it,
right?
And there wasn't an American one. The Boeing 707 was still a few years off. Jet fighter planes were competing against one another. I mean, American versus Russian jet fighters and Chinese fighters in the Korean War, and fighter technology was leaps and bounds. This was where the developments were happening. But all of a sudden, the Russians had these wonderful jet aircraft, and it really was an early version of the space race that convinced us we were losing.
Well, like most of the space race did, right?
Right.
I mean, we inched ahead in the final seconds of overtime in 1969, but every other landmark of the space race, essentially, the Soviets got there first.
And the space race was the big that was the big game toward the end of the 60s, but really it was impractical relative to the practical utility of jet-powered aircraft.
It's straight up put it on a stamp stuff, whereas you can base your economy on passenger jets.
Right.
And your prestige.
So in the late 50s, there was already a lot of energy throughout the aircraft manufacturing world to produce the first supersonic jet airliner. Because, like I say, I mean, that seemed to be where the future was headed. And it was a technological race that was going to, this was going to be a real feather in your cap. But the problem of developing a supersonic passenger jet, it isn't just as simple as put some big engines in an airplane, because the closer you get to supersonic speed, the more and more drag and heat is produced by your airframe. And we learned, or aircraft designers had learned in the process of making supersonic fighters, that certain wing designs were more efficient. This is when you start to see the delta wing fighters, where basically the plane looks like an arrowhead.
They go back like a triangle.
And what they're trying to accomplish with a delta wing is really the lift surface of a delta wing is pretty small. The wings, the longer your wing, the longer the wing, the more lift a plane has.
Okay. But
with lift comes drag. And what you want in a supersonic aircraft, in order to achieve those speeds, you want a lot less drag. And you can sacrifice lift because you've got power, right? You put the power behind it.
You're already up.
Yeah, you get the wings are small, and you get enough speed because you have less drag. But the problem with that, of course, is that at slower speeds, at takeoff and landing, you don't have the lift. The wing isn't generating lift on takeoff to get the plane in the air, and on landing to allow you to slow down enough that you can actually put the plane on the ground and not need a landing strip that's as long as the Mojave Desert. And these were engineering problems that were very difficult to solve, and there were a lot of attempts made to try and figure out this combination of wing design and power plant that would enable a plane that could carry multiple passengers to accomplish these feats. And it was discovered over the course of time that, that in fact, one of the developments that made it possible was the discovery that at a certain angle of attack, on the top of these wings, there would be air vortices, like air would start to spin, because
that's just an effect of
the if the plane's nose is up as it comes in, the air that's going over the top of the wing will actually start to kind of eddy.
Is that bad?
Well, you would think, except what it actually created was more lift. Because the air over the top of the wing was the air under the wing was compressed, and the air above the wing was light by virtue of its being stirred. And this became a design feature, the recognition that you could do a thing that on an airplane with big long wings would create a stall. But on these delta wing airplanes, it actually created enough lift that you could slow the plane down.
Is the flying technique different? Like,
yes.
Pilots would have to relearn?
Yeah, well, every aspect of it had to be relearned. And one of the reasons when you look at a Concorde, when you look at these supersonic jets, and this is true of supersonic bombers too, the reason that you often see them with really long landing gear,
right,
super long nose gear, and the plane kind of is weirdly shaped or sits on the ground in a weird way, it's because that long nose gear is trying to pitch the nose up to actually create that those vortices on the top of the wing enough to generate lift to get it in the air. They have to have a kind of wheelie stance, like a lowrider.
Doesn't it have like a weird beak too?
Well, so the beaks were an attempt to, because of that nose-up attitude, pilots sitting in the pilot seat couldn't see the ground. They couldn't taxi.
Oh, I see.
And so
that's why it bends down?
Yeah, the extending nose that comes down is just to give pilots on the ground the ability to see where they're driving.
Which looks ridiculous. Looks like you're flying a big mosquito.
And so most of the time, the way that we see the Concorde is with its nose drooping down.
Yeah.
Because we don't see it in flight.
Wah, wah.
And as soon as it gets up in the air, that nose comes up and it looks like it just absolutely looks like a bullet. It's a beautiful plane.
I mean, that's cool that it does a little transformer thing.
Yeah.
I'd pay extra for that.
Other things were, there were other design attempts to figure this stuff out, including the kind of foldable wings of like an F-14 or an F-111, like these wings
changes its angle.
Yeah, the angles were wide when they were taking off and landing, and then they could flip back for supersonic flight.
You never took the Concorde, right?
No, the Concorde was super duper expensive.
Yep.
I mean, the equivalent of $15,000 for a ticket.
Yeah.
Even until the very end, and that was because, and one of the reasons that supersonic jet planes weren't successful, and it's widely understood that supersonic air travel was commercially unsuccessful because those flights were prohibited over land in the United States because of the sonic boom. But really, the cost of fuel, almost from the day the Concorde flew its first passenger flight, that was peak oil crisis, and all of a sudden, the fact that it used twice as much fuel made it prohibitively expensive.
I mean, that would be true going forward. Oil prices aren't going to come down. Jet fuel prices aren't going to come down much again. So the trend's not good.
It's funny, in the 1980s, fuel prices came all the way back down to,
That's true.
And even in the 2000s, I remember periods where we were paying a lot less for gasoline than we are now.
I wonder if planes will be aviation's the last place that all the, so much petroleum product will be used, because it's going to be the hardest thing to replace, right?
There's a lot of energy right now going into battery-powered aircraft, and they seem to be right on the threshold of being, I mean, there are battery-powered planes now, but they seem on the threshold of being able to make commercially viable battery-powered flight. I think right now what they're trying to do is you use engines to get it up in the air and then batteries to...
And then the little Prius Leaf turns on once you're cruising altitude.
But I absolutely expect battery-powered aircraft, in not just in our lifetimes, but in the foreseeable future. The problems that were, that prohibited supersonic passenger jets being like just a matter of more force, they confounded everybody that was working on this. And during this period, the United States had a lot of people working on supersonic aircraft. The British and the French were working on competing designs, and over the course of the 1960s, in trying to collaborate with certain elements of their designs, they realized that that there was so much overlap that it made economic sense, and it was kind of a political. It was like marrying the princess to the prince of two different warring nations.
Nowadays, you just marry two jet technologies together. It encourages a lasting peace, and
it did. Their work on the Concorde, the UK and France.
It was the only thing that stopped a massive 20th century war between France and the UK.
It was a wonderful détente, and I think partly, it was an era where NATO and the West all were trying to play, get along with each other. But the Russians recognized that that they needed a supersonic aircraft, and as they worked on solving the problem, some of the technologies that were going to make it actually possible to do were not yet, those technologies weren't yet in the in Soviet development quite to the degree that they were in the West. And this was the problem with the space race. At a certain point, as it evolved from brute force rocket engines and just like it being an industrial process, as it morphed into more and more of a technological process. I mean, if you look at those rocket engines, they're made out of, I mean, they're mostly made from HVAC equipment, right? They're like, you needed welders.
It's basically an aimed target, a targeted tire fire.
Exactly. Whereas increasingly you needed computers to do the calculations and to make the micro adjustments that were going to be necessary to make all these complicated systems work in conjunction. And
Mandrake, we have a micro adjustment gap.
And they did. The Soviets were not making the computer progress that
was the West aware, or was this another case where they were like, oh, what if they're ahead of us on computers too?
I mean, this is one of the questions about espionage, right? That how much we were throughout the second half of the Cold War aware that there was no missile gap or technology gap, that the Russian missiles, although there were a plenitude, had no ability to hit their targets, wouldn't have worked really at all.
It really the intelligence community has some skin in the game to perpetuate
for sure
a scary enemy.
For sure, that's how it's just like the Olestra scientists. You want to get that funding because the funding keeps you alive, and what keeps that funding coming is fear and paranoia.
You might, 6 of the guys on your floor might lose a job in the next congressional budget if you say none of these missiles actually work. They're all going to land in the Arctic Ocean.
But the Tupolev company, which was responsible for the Tu-104 that had been such a public relations and actual practical success, and Tupolev made a lot of bombers, and they were a major airplane manufacturer.
Is that what Aeroflot flew for the whole Cold War? To these Tupolev jets?
Yeah, they made passenger jets and bombers of all shapes and sizes, and there were. So they were charged with the task of developing a supersonic aircraft, and a lot of energy went into it at first. Then the space race kind of overshadowed this process, and in the West, you had the governments were funding this research, but ultimately, like the aircraft themselves were going to be operated by private companies or by the national airline, but that were for profit, right? Air France and British Airways, BOAC. So there was research and development money that on the Russian side kind of got a little bit choked as the 60s wore on, but they had a good design up to a point, and they realized that they didn't. There were aeronautical problems that they couldn't overcome, that they did do a typically Soviet response to the technology problems was to just throw more horsepower at it.
Build it anyway.
As the Concorde got closer, it got more and more refined, they realized that they were going to have to actually kind of manipulate the shape of the wing slightly to maximize the aerodynamics as the airplane flew. And now this is very commonplace technology. Every airplane in the sky has controls that sort of, can change the shape of the wing.
Is that primarily when you see the flaps come down after takeoff and before landing?
Well, flaps have always been a part of airplane wings, but no, they actually, they can kind of raise the leading edge, can kind of change the tips of the wing in order to increase or reduce lift and drag. If you think about the really high performance aircraft, like American fighter planes now, without computers they couldn't fly
because they're just constantly doing these little
the whole movements. Airplane is changing its changing actually the shape of the wing in the plane in order to maximize efficiency, but to keep it in the air. And the Concorde also would change the air intakes just in the course of flight to kind of, just maximize the performance of the engines. What the Soviets didn't have was engines that were efficient enough to fly at supersonic speeds in just regular cruising attitude or cruising. What would you call it? Just regular operation. Mm-hmm. Most fighter jets go supersonic by using what's called afterburner. They pour a bunch of fuel into the basically the exhaust of the engine,
which is already,
and light it again. And all of a sudden you've got, it's
a highway to the danger zone. That's what you got.
It's a huge waste of fuel, but it's the thing that propels the plane that much faster. And the Concorde uses afterburner to get up into the air, but then switches into cruising mode and can cruise at supersonic speeds without afterburner. And the Tupolev, because it wasn't operating with the most efficient sort of wing shape. It didn't have the kind of camber that the other wing did.
They're like Avis. They try harder.
The only way it could stay at supersonic speeds was to be at full afterburner the entire time.
Wow.
And so it burned a ton of gas, and so its range was much shorter.
I wonder what the ride was like.
Well, we'll get to that.
You take a sip of vodka at the wrong time.
So, of course, the Western version of the plane, the French and the British working in conjunction, they were competing with the United States, and Boeing was working on its SST program, but kind of taking a wait and watch approach. And if you think about the 747, the Boeing 747, which was introduced right about this same time, 1968, the idea of the 747 was that it was going to be primarily a freighter, that it was a big, lumbering behemoth, a behemoth.
They didn't think there was a future in passenger flight?
One trip of Pan Am was kind of the big motivator of the 747. Like, he wanted a big plane, fill it with people. But as the SST became, as the late 60s started to show that we were going to be living in this 2001: A Space Odyssey universe where we were all flying around the world supersonically, Boeing thought that this plane was going to be just like a big bus, and what most people were going to want was to be on these hot rod SSTs. Mm-hmm. Boeing spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to build an SST that eventually, as we'll see, they decided it wasn't worth pursuing, partly as a result of the experience of these supersonic planes. And it turned out that the 747 was the most successful airplane of its time, and filled the gap that these SSTs were supposed to fill
for decades longer than they thought.
Right. But the Tupolev kind of again is another milestone where the Soviet Union appeared to be winning the space race. The Tupolev actually flew months before the Concorde and was the first passenger jet to ever achieve supersonic speeds. In 1969, 4 months before the Concorde, it was the first airplane to fly Mach 2, the first passenger jet to fly Mach 2.
Before the Concorde.
Before the Concorde.
We should call the Concorde whatever their Western version of ski was.
Yeah, the Tu-144 ski. The Tu-144...
I don't know. What's a suffix
Jones
that a Russian would use to make fun of us?
And it threw everyone into a tizzy. It looks very much like the Concorde because there was a certain amount of industrial espionage happening. Mm. The Soviets had never been shy about industrial espionage.
Normally that's something that keeps you away from espionage is just shyness.
Shyness.
You're like, well, I would love to know their trade secrets, but what if they say no?
But at the end of World War II, the Soviet government actually produced a version of the B-29. They'd captured a few B-29s.
Slightly off-round, like a backwards B-29.
And there were several, like the the iconic big car of World War II Russian era was basically a note for note copy of the Packard Super 8. They were like notorious copycats. So, and that was why it got called the Concordski. The Tu-144 looked very much like the Concorde, but in a lot of ways was a very different airplane. It was much longer and much bigger, much faster, much louder. But because they didn't have computer control in the wing structure, it actually had two little what were called mustache canards. So up right at the front of the airplane, kind of on either side of the cockpit, there were these two little folding wings that came out and were a whole separate control surface that allowed it to have more lift at slow speeds. This was the problem with both of these aircraft. Because of their delta wing shape, they had to land at really, really kind of dangerously fast speeds. And as
have good brakes.
And as they would get slower, they would totally lose. They weren't very controllable,
yeah.
Right? And another one of the technologies that made the Concorde possible was that they developed carbon fiber brakes as a part of the Concorde development.
They could just put one of those parachutes on the back like they have on race cars.
Well, interestingly, the Tu-144 was one of only a couple of passenger airliners that ever had a parachute. They did put a parachute on.
It was just in case, or they would use it in every landing?
No, they used it because their landing speed was so fast. I mean, the Concorde already landed at 185 miles an hour.
The other thing you can do is just require everyone to land in like 1,000-foot trough of like marshmallow cream.
Yeah, right.
But that's expensive. You go through a lot of marshmallow cream.
Put foam down every time.
Yeah.
The Tu-144 also had, the Concorde, you think of it, it has that big, long nose landing gear, but then it has two clusters of several wheels, I guess probably 4 wheels each on the main landing gear. But the Tu-144, in order to create because this was landing at this speed was so hard on the tires that they built in, and they didn't have very excellent tires, and they didn't have these carbon fiber brakes. So the landing gear of a Tu-144 had 12 wheels.
Just for more friction?
There was a certain amount of redundancy, like as the wheels blew out.
We know we're going to blow a few of these.
You wanted a few on hand. But I think at first blush, it seemed like the Soviet Union was once again leaving the West in its wake. But airplane people recognized right away that the Concordski had sort of rushed to market, and it didn't have the refinement of the Concorde itself. In many ways, I think one of the main ways.
No seats.
Well, there were seats,
everyone
but
was just Velcroed to the ceiling.
The seats were like a row of 5 seats right across the center of the plane.
They hadn't considered aisles.
Very uncomfortable.
Mandrake, we have an aisle gap.
And also, the Concorde had figured out a way to cycle the fuel of the airplane, which is very cold, through the airframe in order to act as a coolant, because the body of a supersonic aircraft gets very hot.
Oh yeah.
And the Soviets hadn't figured that out, and so we're using like turbine cooling to try and cool the aircraft, which was very loud and very ineffective, and it was extremely hot on board the plane.
Oh, interesting.
Hot and loud.
Yeah.
Because the engines were already extremely loud. Then they were on full afterburner the entire time, and they had all these turbines trying to cool the plane.
I guess back, now we associate supersonic jets with that kind of Pan Am 2001 to the moon kind of a thing, where it's kind of a luxury flight experience. But I guess, back then maybe the idea is you're essentially it's the equivalent of a rocket to the moon,
right? And
you're excited to just have their.
It was, I think, exciting at the very first, but then when when people flying on it realized that you couldn't talk to the person next to you, it
Do
was
you
that
want
loud.
meat or fish?
People were actually
What?
passing notes back and forth.
Meat ski or fish ski?
So, although the first flight was in 1969, none of these planes really were ready for public consumption quite yet.
But that didn't stop them from flying them.
They flew them. They made a lot of tests. Another feature that the Tupolev had was that it was the only passenger jet to have ejection seats.
On each seat?
But the ejection seats only were for the pilots.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it's only in first class.
Which would be, that'd be kind of a bummer to be on a passenger flight and start to have problems and
The pilot can just bail.
pilot punches out.
Well, we're having a little trouble up here in the cockpit, folks. So Sergey and I are leaving. What if economy comfort had ejection seat, but regular economy didn't?
Well, I'm already paying for economy comfort, so that makes sense to me. One thing I learned was that, you hear a lot about cracking in airframes because they're always...
You and I travel in very different circles, I understand now.
I
hear almost nothing about cracking in airframes.
They always pull airplanes aside and they check them for cracks. That's one of the things. And, jet aircraft that pressurize a lot. Every time a passenger jet flies, it pressurizes the passenger cabin so that you can breathe regular air. And then it depressurizes, and it's why short distance flights, these shorter jets, 737s or whatever, that make more flights actually have shorter lifespans because
it's the number of pressurizations and depressurizations.
Yeah, that stresses the aircraft a lot more than flying long trips.
Staying up.
Which is why some of those 747s that have been in service since the 1970s are still in service.
Is that what happens when suddenly just the part of the cabin comes off or whatever, and they have to, the Hawaiian Air jet has to just land open like a convertible?
It's like, oh, maybe we should have checked that a little more carefully. But stress fracture is a part of aircraft maintenance, and every airplane has a certain number of cracks.
They should tell you, right?
Yeah.
There should be a little neon sign, like the number of days since an accident on the jetway. It should tell you how many cracks they're up to.
How many cracks there are. On our last inspection, there were only 8,000 cracks in this
It's
aircraft.
like Carfax or whatever. You should know whether you're getting into a lemon or not.
When they build the frame of a aircraft, like for instance, Boeing will put basically like crack arresting fins or devices throughout the frame so that when a crack starts, it cracks up into a crack arrestor.
It hits the little firewall.
Yeah, and then it doesn't continue cracking. And one of the problems that the Tu-144 had is in trying to make a light, aluminum aircraft, there were no crack arresters, and so cracks would start and there would be nothing to impede them.
Just like a Roadrunner cartoon, you can watch it go the length of the cabin.
Just cracking the whole length of it. And so so the Tupolev had a lot of problems from the beginning. It was understood that it was not quite refined, but there was a lot of competition between the Tupolev and the Concorde for kind of global bragging rights. And unfortunately that all came to a head at the 1973 Paris Air Show. Now they've already been flying both the Concorde and the Tu-144 for several years at this point, but they had yet really to bring them to market. And both the Concorde and the Tupolev were on display at the Paris Air Show. And the Concorde had done a flight, had done a demonstration that had kind of wowed the crowd. And the Tupolev was up the following day, and they were going to give a real, knock 'em dead presentation. And in the course of doing the flybys, and I don't know if you've seen the Paris Air Show. A lot of what we see of the Paris Air Show are all the famous crashes,
right?
Because it's like, hey, check out our new plane.
I would try it somewhere else before I took it to Paris. It's like open the show in Connecticut.
Well, what the pilot did was try and show off, and this is a bad thing for pilots to do, particularly when they're flying aircraft. Although that's not always true.
Wait, it's a bad thing for pilots to predict when they're flying aircraft, but you also think it's bad when they're showing off in regular life.
If they're showing off in a bar,
like just telling a story a long story at a party, or.
But there's that famous Boeing test pilot that flew the 707 upside down, and
he got a promotion.
Right? This was a case where the pilot of the Tu-144 was going to show everybody what it could do, and in pulling up a very kind of a steep climb that people in the know would understand, really stressed the airframe. He pulled up into a steep climb, and it did stress the airframe in that the airframe came apart in midair.
Oh, no.
And the plane fell to the ground and sort of killing everyone. It landed on a little French village and I think killed a lot of people in the village.
Wait. That's a terrible Paris air show. That would be like the worst one.
Yeah, it was really bad.
You don't want to lose a whole village every time you have an event. The event will soon get canceled. If a whole village died every time they did SakuraCon, manga conventions would be illegal.
If you God willing. If you think about the number of people living in villages around the airport where the Paris Air Show happens, you would think that would be, if you were thinking about moving, I mean, it would depress housing prices, right?
There's probably fewer now. I mean, what are the odds a plane's going to fall in that same village again? I'd move there.
Right. Interesting.
Did the pilot eject?
No, they all died. Oh. I'm afraid that isn't a very happy story. There aren't a lot of happy stories about the Tu-144.
I can see why. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, they finally brought it into service at the end of 1975, but it was only as a cargo jet, and it only served one route. It flew between Moscow and Almaty, Kazakhstan. Because it was like a short enough distance. It was far enough away to make it worth it, but short enough that you could fly at full afterburner and have enough fuel.
And riddle me this: is there any? I mean, I assume the advantage of the Concorde was you get passengers to pay a premium price for the convenience of fast arrival. Does that hold for cargo jets at all? I mean, does anybody really care whether the packages get there in 3 hours or 6?
Well, you have to wonder
I guess you could send cake.
Within the Soviet economy, who
is rushing things to Almaty?
Yeah, who cares? I mean, who in Almaty wants caviar and gets to have it 2 hours faster?
Was it like DoorDash? Like you want the pizza to still be hot?
It's 100% that the Soviets at this point have to put it into regular commercial service
because it's a marker of the achievements of Marxist Leninism.
That's right. They have this is, if you're going to make it into the magazines, you have to have it in commercial service. It's just sort of like if your car is going to run in the Grand Prix, you have to make a certain number of them.
It's true. That is the big. I think we all assume there are flying cars and jetpacks and all kinds of crazy things. They're just experimental, weird prototypes. And if it only exists at Epcot, that's the same as not existing.
Right. The whole business of like supersonic jets not going into widespread production because the sonic boom affected people in Ames, Iowa. When you think about it, it really that kind of doesn't hold water for a couple of reasons. One, no one on the coasts has ever cared about the experience of people in Ames, Iowa, right? I mean, if people in Nebraska were complaining about sonic booms, how would that ever affect what the Air Force or Boeing chose to do? But more importantly, if supersonic aircraft, I mean, why would Qantas or Japan Airlines not be using those aircraft?
Well, even a U.S. airline, as long as the flight originates over the coast, just fly out to sea 3 miles, go supersonic, and then nobody in Nebraska would ever have to hear it again. It's only landlocked to landlocked, right?
Well,
do you keep making sonic booms at multiple times during
yeah.
Why?
The airplane creates a sonic boom that travels with the airplane. It's an effect of the an effect of the shock wave of the plane going through the air at that speed.
Oh, it doesn't. Once you pass Mach 1, you just keep making sonic booms.
It's just like, as the plane goes by, you hear the boom. They like the cars that go boom.
Everybody gets a sonic boom. You get a boom, and you get a boom, and you get a boom.
But there's no reason why supersonic jet aircraft wouldn't have found commercial applications if they were an efficient way if they were commercially viable. And really it was fuel costs, but also the aircraft had to be quite a bit smaller. You know, you could put 100 people on a SST. You can put, 400 people in one of these Airbus, like super cows, whatever they're called.
Yeah. They're inches away from each other fighting over the armrests, but it's 4 times as many people.
Yeah, and it ends up being just economies of scale. I really regret there not being SST flights to Australia. That, of all the places that you want the flight time to be half as long.
So what, you would get to Australia in 10 hours or so? Less?
Oh, no, I think less, right? Isn't it
From
a
the West
14-hour flight? Would you get there in 7 hours? Would it be just as
I don't know.
easier than going to London?
Yeah, maybe. I guess it's Australia to the East Coast that is. Doesn't that flight push 20 hours? But to the West Coast would be shorter.
So. You can also really reduce the sonic boom by engineering the shape of the aircraft to glide through the air with the greatest of ease.
Or by just playing a constant series of booms in Ames, Iowa. Like maybe a big brass band in the bandstand at the center of town,
or have those speaker systems that play the boom back at the boom, so it cancels it out,
like a Bose noise canceling SST.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yes.
In the case of the regular flights to Almaty, there was, I guess, a lot of pressure to open up passenger flights. If you can imagine.
Pressure from the Kremlin, probably.
Yeah, if you can imagine being the first passenger on that flight. It happened in November of 1977. They opened up passenger flights to Almaty from Moscow. Hopefully, you can only guess who was on that flight. They limited seating and limited the number of VIPs that could be on there because their expectation was that every one of them would crash. And there was now a second crash in 1978, just 3 years after, 2.5 years after regular service began. In June of 78, another one crashed, killing all aboard. And so they were taken out of service. So their whole service lifetime.
That's the same number of 737s, right? So that's, what was it, three in order to take them out of service?
Yeah, but there were a lot more
successful flights.
Right. In the time that they flew, they made 16 of them. They flew 102 flights all told.
Oh, total. Each plane. 102. Each plane went about 7 or 8 times.
Yeah. They carried passengers on 55 flights total.
Wow. I wonder who will be the last surviving person who bought a ticket on a Concordski.
Yeah, there have to be people in the Soviet Union. They're like, yeah, I flew on one. I was a high-ranking government official, but not high-ranking enough that they didn't feel like they could risk my life.
Right. I was an apparatchik, but not an apparatsky.
The kind of Soviet industrial espionage technology stealing was perhaps during this era on most blatant display with the development of the Soviet Buran space shuttle, which
let me guess,
it really warrants its own omnibus, but I'll put it here instead as a placeholder. But the Buran is actually, if you put it next to the space shuttle, it's a carbon copy. They looked into the design of the space shuttle, and I think they were very worried about the space shuttle in particular, because all of the stories that we've heard about the space shuttle, like, the reusability and the payload that it offered, when you look at the actual experience of the space shuttle, none of it really makes sense. Like, it's not a good way to put satellites into orbit because you can just put a satellite on top of a cheap rocket.
You're doing a full rocket launch every time.
Yeah, you just throw the satellite up there. You don't need to take it up there in a school bus. The reusability of the thing, that's not cheaper. It costs so much more money to get the space shuttle in the air in the first place. The fact that you can fly it and land it on an airport and then send it back up, is that cheaper than just making Apollo capsules?
That was just for TV. And the water landings are pretty good on TV too. So.
Right. So the whole thing seemed to the Soviets like a real false flag operation. And what the space shuttle would be really good at was military use. Yeah. And it's the whole plot of Moonraker that you get up there with your space shuttle and capture enemy satellites.
You got lasers.
Yeah, there was a lot of reasons for the USSR to believe that the space shuttle program was a military program.
It was because the Canadians put that big claw in it.
The claw, Canadian claw.
I would think it was an enemy too if I saw a big Canadian claw coming at me.
So they needed to get their own. They had a space shuttle gap at that point, and they basically just hook, line, and sinker took the space shuttle. The difference being that they kind of did a better job of it. We have the off-brand space shuttle. On the space shuttle, part of what lifts the space shuttle into orbit is the engine, the fuel tank is powering not the solid rocket boosters on either side, but actually the main thrusting engine of the space shuttle itself
is powered from the
is what's a big part of what's getting it into orbit.
Yeah, it's true. You see it at launch. You see it lit at launch.
Right. Whereas the Russian space shuttle, the Buran, it's just using the rockets that it's connected to. The space shuttle itself is mostly a glider. And so it doesn't have all this complexity of
it's just an Apollo capsule that can land.
Right. It's just an airplane, but they didn't bother with
that seems smart. Why didn't we do that?
Kind of not that bad.
Come on, Moonraker.
And so they were working on the Buran through this whole period. And in fact, one of the last things after they took the Tu-144 out of service, as a passenger jet, they did use it as part of the test as a test platform for the Buran.
Just like we use this M47.
That's right. Well, no, they didn't carry the Buran on it. They actually had a fake 747 to do that. No, they used it to because it was capable of very high altitude flight. It was capable of this very fast
test all
flight.
the systems.
Yeah, they were testing systems, and they it was kind of like an astronaut test plane. The Buran, unfortunately, only flew once, and it was an unmanned flight. So they launched it, big space shuttle launch in 1988. But it was uncrewed. They had it down to.
Was it an accident? They started it remotely, and the crew's like, no, we're still at mission control.
Wait, space shuttle ski. No, it was actually kind of a triumph. They proved the right stuff. They proved the flip side of the right stuff, which was this can all be done by robot.
In Soviet Russia, cosmonauts stay on ground,
and it actually came in and landed like an airplane, just like the space shuttle. But it didn't. But it had nobody on board. Autopilot. And this was happening in 1988. By the time they were ready to start scaling that project up, the Soviet Union collapsed, and their space shuttle never flew again. And in fact, I think the surviving one, the one that flew, was destroyed in a hangar collapse. So basically, destroyed in a tragic hangar accident that also somehow killed like 8 people. Just the hangar collapsing.
It's like their Universal Studios fire.
Yeah.
Wow, I agree. That should be its own omnibus.
Well, too bad.
Please disregard all the cool stuff we were saying about the Soviet space shuttle.
Maybe 5 years from now, I'll do the Buran.
Give yourself a Men in Black memory wipe so you can pretend to be surprised.
But that was not actually the end of the Tupolev 144. They went into mothballs, but toward the end of the 1990s, NASA had a program called the High Speed Research Program, where they were kind of researching stuff that needed to happen at volume in in an aircraft that's going this fast, and they didn't have a spare Concorde. We had lots of airplanes that could go Mach 2, but they were all fighter jets. I mean, they
too small to do the systems test they needed to do.
Yeah, we didn't have these. We didn't have supersonic aircraft on hand that were useful to NASA, and at that point in time, all the Concordes were in service, flying Phil Collins back and forth across the Atlantic.
It was just for Phil Collins.
And no one would loan one to NASA.
He would often buy out the whole plane just to keep Peter Gabriel off.
And at that point, there was we didn't exactly have friendly relations with now the Russian Federation, such that they would just loan us one of their mothballed Tu-144s. So a series of shell companies were set up. A woman by the name of Judith DePaul, who is a very strange character, very hard to find a lot out about. She has an IMDb page because she was a producer on a few documentaries about Philip Mountbatten, and I think there's one she helmed a documentary about Gilbert and Sullivan, your favorites.
Alone. Can't get enough of those witty Britishers.
But she set up a shell company called the IBP, which bought or rented a Tupolev Tu-144 from the Russian Federation, and then through a series of like
they thought they were just renting it out for a party or something?
No, they knew it was happening, but they needed plausible deniability.
Oh, okay.
I think it was a thing where NASA showed up on the docks with 100,000 gallons of gasoline, and the Tu-144 was dragged out of mothballs, reconditioned, brought to the Americas. They put new engines in it. Like, they did a major rehaul on the aircraft to make it safe to fly. And then, but, only a Russian crew knew how to fly it. There was a period where the Russians were flying the plane, but at the end of the flight, they weren't able to say what their experiences had been because that wasn't part of their contract. And there was a thing where, wait a minute, the whole reason we're doing this is to figure out what the pilots think, but they were like, oh, sorry, cross our palms. So there is one pilot in the world, a man by the name of Rob Rivers. And of course,
American?
Yeah, of course, if you're a hot dog pilot, your name is going to be something like Rob Rivers.
Sounds like kind of a low rent fake superhero name.
But Rob Rivers had flown he'd ridden in flown enough Concordes, riding in the cockpit, kind of doing research, and I think had controlled the flight of the Concorde, and then got drafted into service as the test pilot for the Tu-144. He's the only living person to have flown both aircraft, the Concorde and the Tupolev.
I wonder which he prefers.
Well, he said that although the Concorde was a more refined aircraft, that the Tupolev had
moxie,
its own charms, and it was
seems very diplomatic. This Rob Rivers.
It was like the difference between driving a Porsche and a Mack truck. But the Tupolev had its last flight as late as 1999 in June. A lot of the big moments in the Tupolev's life happened in June. Its first flight was in June of 1969. It crashed in June of 1978. Its last flight was June of 1999.
Maybe they only flew it in summer. They're like, there's no way this thing can make it in
That's
cold
probably
weather.
What it was. It was a summertime plane.
It's the only summertime only jet.
So Rob Rivers is out there. I'm sure there are a handful of other people that have survived long enough to recount the tale of flying it. And Judith DePaul also seems to
mysterious Miss DePaul.
Still a shadowy figure on the fringe.
Judith, if you're listening, call us. And that concludes Concordski, entry 258.JE4606. certificate number 36689, in the omnibus. Futurelings, if you would like to write in, if you are one of the few people that has a first-hand experience with the Concorde, you can communicate with us in various ways in our era. Send us your Concordski stories to @OmnibusProject on any of various social media platforms. I'm Ken Jennings. I'm @KenJennings. You can find @John Roderick on his Patreon. You could email us at theomnibusproject@gmail.com. You could send us physical mail. If you have, do you think there are toys? Are there toy Concordskis? Send us a little Soviet die-cast Concordski.
I'm sure there are toy Burons. There must be toy Concordskis. Sure.
What does Buron mean?
Bear.
Of course.
Bushel.
Oh, you don't know?
No, but I'm going to guess. I'm going to guess bear.
Just say bear.
Right? The Russian bear? The Russian Buron? What is it?
It's a wind of Central Asia.
Oh.
Bringing sandstorms in summer and blizzards in winter. So it's like naming your
high school paper the Zephyr.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or what are some other winds like that? The Scirocco.
The Scirocco, that's right, which was a Volkswagen.
Oh, yeah, there you go. What was I even saying? Oh, yes. So send us your diecast planes to the Omnibus Project at P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington, 98155. You don't have to send us free stuff. John will say you do, but I feel like there are multiple ways to support the show.
Send us free stuff. Oh, yeah. Well, there's a great way to support the show. Our Patreon.
That's right. You could go to patreon.com/omnibusproject and become one of the elite class of Omnibus listeners who can receive a bonus episode every month or other fantastic perks that make you feel special, better than others. It's the main reason why people do anything, to feel like they're getting something that others are missing out on. And that's what Patreon is for.
That's right. That's what religion is for.
Religion and Patreon and airline medallion status all have the same purpose in the end.
If you survive the flight, then you have bragging rights the rest of your life.
You can look up your fellow listeners and donors either on the Patreon page or at the Futurelings Hangouts on Facebook and equivalent.
Futurelings, from our vantage point in your distant past, when we still were afraid of supersonic flight, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. When battery-powered, super slippery airplanes are finally a thing, where I can fly from here to Perth in 4 hours, and no one in Tonga is disturbed by the sound.
And it's got to be slippery.
Then I'll know we will
It's got to be covered in butterfish oil.
We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear that would result from supersonic aircraft covered in butterfish oil, we hope that catastrophe never comes. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.